Welcome to Monetizing Innovation. I'm John Holcomb, the best-selling author of Creating Value Faster. Today on Monetizing Innovation, we're joined by Stan Glezer, Managing Director at Outcome Capital, an investment bank focused on healthcare and life sciences. Stan works at the critical intersection of innovation, capital, and commercialization, helping companies navigate financing, partnerships, and strategic transactions to scale breakthrough technologies. With deep experience across the digital health and tech enabled healthcare, he brings a front row perspective on what investors actually value and how companies position themselves for growth. In this episode, we unpack how to bridge innovation with capital and what it really takes to build companies that attract investment and deliver outcomes. And welcome to the episode today. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, John. Appreciate you inviting me. Looking forward to the discussion.
Oh, absolutely. You have such a varied background, which is really fantastic, which actually gives you such a unique perspective, right? Especially at Outcome Capital. Could you share some of your background to give folks a sense of the things that you have done and what you're doing now at Outcome Capital?
Absolutely. So, I mean, yeah, I like the descriptive terminology that you were using, but I heard words interesting. I heard words eclectic. I heard things messy. So, I mean, that's how you look at it, right? So my background is I'm a managing director at Outcome Capital. As you have mentioned, we are an investment bank and a strategic advisory firm exclusively focused on human life sciences. And let's put it this way, when I was growing up, I wasn't thinking of becoming an investment banker. So I come from a family where I'm the fourth generation of the physicians. I am a physician by training, have an MBA, postgrad in health ec and clinical research, and very shortly after graduation from med school, I actually transitioned to the life sciences industry. I work in pharma, I worked in biotech, I worked in medtech. So I've spent about 30 years in operating roles before moving to the investment banking. One could argue that that transition from the clinical to industrial experience to the financial service, I mean, it's not usual generally, but in outcome, it's actually a reasonably common trajectory. As we keep on joking, we're an investment bank that doesn't hire investment bankers. My colleagues are former CEOs, former heads of business units, former heads of R&D in the operating life sciences companies. And there is a method to the madness, if I may say, because, oftentimes when we interact with the companies, they come with the story that sounds like, well, we have a product or we have a technology, we need money. And you go like, it's great, who doesn't? The art here is in translating the value of that innovation into the value for the return for the investors or for the partners, right? And so what you need to do is you need to translate all of those operational priorities from the R&D, clinical development, regulatory, IP, market access, and so on, into the path to liquidity. You need to figure out where in this journey the value inflection will happen. And you really cannot do this unless you have been an operator, unless you know what does it take to actually get the product from the idea all the way to the commercial success, right? And there are many steps and challenges that are involved with this. So unless you have done it, you cannot dream it up. And so that's kind of the foundational premise behind the firm. And, why my background is not that eclectic, actually, is that when you are an operator, you can do this. If you don't have that operating experience, you're a generalist, and generalists don't succeed in this business.
Yeah, and I think that's just so powerful, right? Because you actually do have the scars on your back of actually building, those businesses and working in the different sectors. Really like that perspective when you think about the challenges. When you look at that and seeing such a wide range of healthcare and life science companies, what separates the ones that successfully attract that capital from those that struggle?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. Essentially, look, if you subscribe to any of the news services and life sciences about the transactions, whatever your favorite channel is, every day you get those news like, listen, this company raised that much money, this company just, got acquired, this company signed licensing. You have that feeling that transactions are all over the place and happening all the time in large numbers. But what people don't realize is that if you look at the number of life sciences companies currently active and actively looking for those kind of transactions, it's a huge denominator. What you're seeing in the news daily are rare events. And so the question is, to your point, what distinguishes those who succeed versus the vast majority of those who don't? And it's a combination of things. Essentially, transactions are a function of time, place, and circumstance, right? And so what you need to do is you need to align yourself favorably to those metrics. So one of the things that we do, we don't look just at the company, we're looking at the dynamics within the sector and dynamics within the market to align those three things. Clearly recognizing that we cannot influence the sector and we cannot influence the market. You need to be aligned, but the one thing that is influenceable is the company, right? So I just wanted to preface this that even with the best intent, if you're in the wrong segment or you are in the wrong market trend, I mean, it's not going to be successful no matter how great you are. But what needs to happen is you need to prepare yourself for when the conditions become favorable that you seize that opportunity, right? So then if you look at the company internally, typically when I look at the project, I look at it from four lenses that has kind of, successful filters. First one is clinical value proposition. We are in the business of improving health and longevity of people, and, any new technology has to align to that benefit, right? So the question that we usually ask is whatever it is that you are doing, how will this be disproportionately better than anything else that is out there for solving the same issue or will be out there by the time you get to the market? So if you can answer this question, very specific terms, this is in whom we're improving this health or well-being, this is on what parameter, by how much, as compared to what, at what time point, then we're in conversation. If I hear motherhood statements, listen, we're developing novel vaccines, I mean, it's kind of good. It doesn't tell me anything.
Exactly.
Right? So it's that specificity and clarity on the end goal from the benefit perspective, clinical benefit perspective, that we need to hear and the investors need to hear. Then from there it comes the next question. Okay, this is great, but what about the technological feasibility? This is just,
Mhm.
an idea. Can this be developed into the product? And this is where we look at all the technical and clinical and whatever. Then the next question is, can this be approved? What do you have clear regulatory strategy? Do you have the plan? Do you understand what regulatory requirements for evidence and quality documentation will be? Okay, perfect. If you have this, the next question is, what is the commercial strategy and potential, including market access? Lay it down to me. How big is the market? And, again, this is where a lot of people fall into this trap of saying, I need to show the biggest TAM. Here is the $15 billion market opportunity.
Yeah.
No, listen, I mean, I don't think you're going to get this whole TAM, right? Tell me what specifically your business plan does look like in terms of the particular segment, particular rate of penetration, investment to commercialization, all of those things, right? And so if we line all of those things, then we can say, okay, this is where the value inflection will be on this journey. And this is critical because what people fail to explain to the investors is how do the investors make money. Investors are not in the business of putting money into the company, they're in the business of taking money out of the company, right? No investor is assessed on how much capital did they deploy. They are assessed on the rate of return. Return means taking money out. So what we need to explain to the investor is when and how will they take the money out, why this is plausible and validated, what's the level of risk. Then you have meaningful conversation. Everything else is fluff. Right. And then the next thing that is absolutely critical is, okay, let's say I give you the money. Who will live and breathe my success based on this money invested? It's the team that matters. Right? People invest in the teams before they invest in the products and tech. You need to have an investable team because if you ever done product development, things will go wrong. Absolutely will. And what happens is a B-level team with the best product, when this happens, will get derailed and will die. An A-level team, even with the B-level product, will say, yeah, that's fine. I mean, there are so many other ways we can approach this, and we'll just, pivot and continue going. So this is why team is critically important. If you have that combination and you have clarity on value inflection and the market and segment conditions are right, chances are you will succeed.
Yeah, I love that level of of clarity that you bring to that because I think you're so spot on. I think many folks, even with that step one that you mentioned, disproportionate value. It can't just be a small incremental improvement, right? It needs to be a big step, and it has to be a market that can be served, right? And that team is so critical in the delivery.
No, absolutely. And look, I mean, I have nothing against incremental innovation, but that incremental innovation has to have very clear fit
Mhm.
and the possibility of being scaled up. Look, I mean, if you look at basic health economics models, I mean, obviously, if you deliver incremental benefit, you can justify premiums, all good. But there are innovations that are more incremental, or, it doesn't deliver clinical benefit, but it delivers savings. There's nothing wrong with that. Where the benefit comes from is that it democratizes the technology and makes it accessible to so many patients. So although benefit to the individual patient is the same, at the population level, your benefit is huge, right? So you need to think as to how do you deliver value. And I mean, I have worked with teams of engineers, and one thing that, is always kind of exciting is that when the engineer comes in and says, "Hey, you know what? We can actually do this new feature, and this is going to create this new button, and it's great. We'll have." And we called it buttonology. People develop stuff because they can, not because they understand where it's going to be valuable to the end user. That's what is usually scary and is a big kind of commitment killer. If you can say, "Listen, you know what? We're going to make this better, or we're going to make this cheaper, or better both, we're going to make it better and cheaper," okay, then we have a conversation.
Absolutely, and it really gets back to that return on investment, right? It has to be creating that value that the investors can get their money back.
Yeah,
I think that's so true. Living in that world myself as well, right? Working with engineers and things like that. It is great. You see some wonderful ideas, some wonderful optimism, but you have to still start with the question. That's like, does the customer care? And that customer could be different
yeah,
parts of the value chain, right?
because otherwise it's yet another button.
Absolutely. I love that buttonology. I want to borrow that from you. So, when you think about especially founders and I'd say younger companies, what is the right time for them to actually start pursuing capital, versus partnerships or strategic transactions?
So I don't think there is a one fits all kind of binary answer to this. Obviously, one thing that people keep on saying, I mean, the CEO should be constantly raising money, but it is often misinterpreted. And let me clarify why. If you are reaching out to the investors or to the strategic counterparts with the half-baked story or product that's not ready for the transaction, what happens is if they are not nice, they're going to tell you, "I'm not interested." If they're nice, they're going to tell you, "Yeah, that's kind of interesting, a little bit early for us, but why don't we keep each other updated?" And people don't appreciate what that latter response means. If you think about large strategic corporation operating at multi-billion dollar levels internationally and so on, you know how many things are in the "let's keep each other updated" bucket? Digging yourself out of there is not an easy task. And the same is true to the investors. They are bombarded with the request for funding. "Let's keep each other updated" is one of those things that looks good on their funnel slides and the pipeline slides, but they have no intention or immediate trigger to take things out of there. And so companies get excited saying, "Hey, you know what? We have those relationships, but those relationships are not transactable or monetizable." And that's highly deceiving. So the thing is, you should not be approaching anybody with the discussion of the transaction if you are not ready for this transaction. You need to show up as really exciting, prime time ready, fully ironed out kind of opportunity. On the flip side, there is a polar opposite position, which is let's go stealth up until we absolutely ready and everything is the rest, right? And then you show up out of the woodworks, nobody has any idea, and you have those kind of, strategies that have never been validated with the real market. And chances are that whatever you dreamt up is not quite right and does not quite fit. So you need to get that market feedback, and you need to make sure that you understand the segment, you understand the priorities of the counterparts, you understand the market. Then you can have the strategy that's validated for that primetime pitch. So the way to do it is to engage into those conversations with the strategics and with the VCs and with private equity if it's relevant to you. But be clear with them, you're not reaching out for the transaction. You're reaching out to understand their needs, you're reaching out to build relationship, and you asking for the advice, you're asking for help, you're asking for guidance. People love giving advice, right? But that gets you into the situation where you're not pitching, but you're validating your strategy with the real world evidence and with the real tangible inputs. That gets you into the position to drive towards real outcome that will resonate with the market whenever you're ready to pitch.
I think that is so important, because it really is making sure you're doing the fundamentals of building your business case, right? And validating it with those that actually care, you know? And
Yeah,
especially in this case, the funding, right? You want to make sure you're satisfying their needs.
absolutely. This is absolutely paramount. You cannot dream up the world, as we keep on joking. Put three guys, smart guys, and ask them for strategy, they'll come up with five strategies.
Exactly.
And chances are none of them will resonate.
Oh, I was just thinking, especially as you shared that, I know you're advising on several high stake transactions. Can you share an example where positioning or the narrative significantly changed the outcome, especially through those interactions?
Yeah, so obviously, look, I mean, a lot of work that we're doing is
Mhm.
confidential, so I cannot give you,
Absolutely.
but let me give you a real example with a little bit of camouflage around it. So we had interesting, innovative technology which can be applicable across broad spectrum of indications, right? And for categorization, let's say there is a rare disease indication, there is high unmet medical need but smaller size indication, and then there are mass market indications. And so when we looked at this technology, we said, okay, listen, mass market, it's busy, there are already a lot of players in there. So what's unique about this technology, right? We were asking that very question,
Mhm.
what is the disproportionate value? And that led us on the path of saying, well, it's the rare disease and this high unmet medical needs, small size market, right? So we framed the initial kind of storytelling around those two aspects because there is nothing else out there. You can literally save lives with this. And so we went to rare disease players and we went to the kind of larger pharma players. And the rare disease players got us. Well, I mean, the rare disease component is so interesting to us, but it's this other kind of, smaller, but still, not rare disease indication that's off strategy to us. So, you know what? This is off strategy because the sum total just does not work for us. And then when we start talking to the larger pharma, they said, kind of interesting what you're saying about the smaller market. And I mean, we understand the needs of the patients, but can we use it in the bigger indication? What happens is we had a story that was strategically sound and based on the science and, based on the understanding of the market. But what we learned is that it doesn't resonate with either of the segment because each of the segment has somewhat differently aligned priorities. And that's what we did. We separated this differently. We said, here is the rare disease deck, strictly for the rare disease players, nothing else in there, right? And then here is the deck for the larger players who are in the mass market, talking about mass market, but explaining how this is a differentiated offering through the example of that smaller indication, right? So we reframed it completely. But that also led us to redefine the asset. Meaning, we're no longer doing a single transaction for this company because there is no single entity who is interested in this thing, splitting the asset into the two assets that are based on the indications. Separate license, separate transactions, right? So this is kind of what this is a real world example where you go out with a strategy, you go through the step of validation before the pitch, and you learn that actually it does need tweaking before you start pitching. That's what we did, and it resonated. So this is kind of what we live through day in, day out. That's why I'm saying this validation step is absolutely critical.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think that validation step, right, is so easy to kind of miss, right? Especially for the early stage companies, because they are still trying to learn and get that data. And I love that example. That's fantastic. When you look at ahead, especially, for the whole healthcare segment, what are some of the biggest opportunities that you see for value creation? And what will differentiate the companies that will win?
Right. So look, there are a lot of opportunities for improving patient care. And, when people are saying, okay, tell me what therapeutic area is hot. I don't know. I mean, ophthalmology, oncology, immune inflammation, neurology, maybe some cardiovascular. I mean, I can keep on going and I can find you very great examples in any of those areas. That's not necessarily the question. I think that if you step back and you look at macro trends, right, there are a few things that are happening. One is the healthcare system generally has still not quite recovered from the hit it took during the COVID times, right? A lot of hospitals are in the red, and that has significantly changed market dynamics from the situations where hospitals will say, listen, you know what, this kind of makes sense clinically. My head of the department of whatever wants it, and it does seem that we can put it within the budget. Let's go and bring in this new technology. Right now the dynamic is different. Unless we absolutely have to use it and there is no way around it, we're not going to take it. So no matter how great your story is, unless it's essential, it's not going to be picking up, right? So people need to think not just about clinical value but the economic value, and not in hypotheticals in terms of cost benefit analysis. No, it's really cost minimization. We need to come to terms with an idea that the innovation has to reduce the costs, direct costs, and has to do it within the budget cycle, not 10 years from now, within the budget cycle. So that's kind of one area that's clearly absolutely important. The other area that people have to think about is the role of AI in the discovery process. There is obviously a lot of use cases that have been generated over the past 2 to 3 years with democratization of AI. And people are saying, well, okay, listen, we don't need doctors, we don't need diagnostics anymore. We don't, I mean, just load it into the AI. It's going to tell you exactly what to do, and it's going to come up with a novel treatment exactly for your case, right? Okay, fantastic. I mean, keep on watching Terminator movies. Reality is that in order to train AI algorithms, you need large size data sets. There are very strong data repositories in the areas of cell biology, chemistry, and biochemistry. So from that perspective, AI has transformed things to multiples of orders of magnitude in terms of efficiency of identifying targets and identifying new ways of interacting with those targets, which did fuel the pipeline at the discovery phase of biopharma innovation with tons of compounds. However, if you look at the other end of the spectrum, the data from clinical trials is fragmented, it's not easily accessible, it's not designed for meta-analytics at large scale, and therefore translating the potential of those molecules and those mechanisms of actions into the clinical outcomes is not a given, and AI ain't going to help you with this. So the challenge is we now have way richer early stage pipelines than we used to have, but still very limited translatability of that pipeline. That would still require a lot of work from the preclinical, clinical, reg, and so on perspective to actually turn it into the products. The other thing that's associated with this is that AI is still useful in clinical development, but more from the operational side of things. And it's also useful in regulatory aspects, but more from the operational side of things again, right? So there will be improvement in the speed and cost of those aspects, but it's not exponential curves. It's maybe an order of magnitude, maybe two, but still people need to think about those improvements in efficiency because you're talking large amounts of money and large and, pretty protracted development timelines. So I think that this is where we're going to see improvements. And then when it comes to medtech, particularly areas of imaging, signal analytics, closed loop systems, I think those are the areas where the current approach to the algorithms with the AI enablement will definitely drive things forward. If you're asking me where I see, significant changes and things being disrupted, I mean, those would be the ones that I would probably highlight.
And I think that's so helpful, right, for folks to understand that perspective because it still drives back to your very first point, right, of the four criteria that you look at. When you look at, cost of operating in the hospitals, you have to figure out how you work with that customer set. Just like AI can also help on some of that, to your point, you still have to go through the basics of building that operational case of how you're creating that value.
Right. Maybe, let me add one more layer to
Mhm.
this, which is we need to think about healthcare delivery maybe slightly differently than what we've done historically. Because the biggest burden on healthcare system is being produced by patients with rare disease, with chronic disease. And if you look at the proportion of time that these people spend in healthcare system as opposed to they spend outside of healthcare system is a fraction,
Mhm.
small fraction of it, right? I mean, and at some point years ago, we've done mapping of patient journey with type 2 diabetes. We added all the tests, all the physician visits, all of those things. It added up to a day and a half in a year. Day and a half, right? So the challenge is if you're trying to influence how this disease will progress and what the patient will do and how adherent they will be through this day and a half is a very tall order, right? What we need to think about is how do we look at people as opposed to patients and how can we manage health as opposed to disease? And I think that with the sensing technologies, with the point of care technologies, with the integration of consumer activities of daily living data with the healthcare data, we can actually have meaningful way of improving health of the populations besides or in addition to healthcare system. I think that this is where there is going to be the next breakthrough in terms of efficient management of chronic diseases. And we need to start thinking about, as I said, people and consumers as opposed to patients and healthcare.
Yeah, I think that's such a great perspective, right? And I think that does go to how the system's currently designed, and really thinking about people versus just the patient is a great way to look at that.
Okay. And look, I'll give you a specific example, right? I mean, I've spent a significant portion of my career working in diabetes and obesity. I mean, when people are saying, well, let's reduce blood glucose, okay, that's great. Problem is that a lot of patients are just not adherent to this, right? It's not because they are ill-intended or they want to harm themselves. No, there is significant overlap with other comorbidities. For example, I mean, there is a significant proportion of those who have clinical depression. So unless you address the depression, I mean, you're not going to get them adherent to anything else, right? And by the way, you're then telling them, well, okay, you need to walk more and do some exercise. Guess what? If they're obese and have knee osteoarthritis, they're not going to run around, right? So you need to think about that individual and how do they go through their life in order to make them adherent and make those things relevant to that. And then the other thing that's critical is that the kind of solution from, 10, 20 years ago was let's send them messages. Let's just nudge them into this. First thing that they're going to do, they're going to turn them off because, first of all, it's a reminder that they're sick. And two, it's annoying, right? So that just doesn't work. People need to interact with humans, but when they do, the problem is humans are very expensive. So the art here is to figure out where the machine with the tailored digital
Right.
interactions can maintain them well versus when do they become unstable and they actually need human to handhold them and adjust things. So if you were asking me where there is the next big opportunity is in identifying points where you need to transition from machine to human and human to machine. That will create an effective system which is actually integrating healthcare with the more consumer type management.
I think that's such a fantastic point. I think sometimes with the AI hype, right, that we hear in the media and everything else, we forget how important the human role really is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the synergy between the two. It's not one versus the other.
Exactly. No, I think that's fantastic. Yeah, Stan, this has been such a wonderful conversation. At this point, is there anything that I haven't asked, I should have asked, that you would like to make aware for the audience?
Right. So the only other thing that I would say, I mean, we spend this interview talking about theory, talking about the examples, talking about the logic. The only thing that I would like to add to this is that at the end of the day, and you're talking about transactions or fundraising or whatever, human decisions are emotional. And building the relationship, building trust, validating things is critically important. It's not just about a great slide deck and, sending it to the whole universe of whoever you have as contacts. So if, on this theme about, human versus machine, transactions are human driven. So what I'm trying to say is that whatever it is that you're doing in terms of the process and, the interactions that you have, it has to emotionally resonate with the person on the other side. You need to bring them to your side. And then they will use your pitch, your information, whatever, to just confirm that the decision that they want to take is rational and plausible, rather than the other way around. So I just want to make sure that people understand that no matter what, humans will be in this business and it's humans who will be taking the decisions. So anyway, just that, quick thing, because again, we are remaining in this business and we will be in this for that very reason. You need to have those relationships. You need to make those connections. You need to get people to the emotional decisions supported by the evidence.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, and especially for any entrepreneur or executive, right? That's critical to understand the emotional component and really help tie those pieces together with the data.
Absolutely.
Stan, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I truly appreciate your insight today. I think it'll really help the audience in terms of, really, how some of these steps are necessary, right, to build your business case, and whether it's for funding or just for success. This is a critical way, and I really appreciate your vast perspective. on the topic of innovation.
Yeah, thank you, John. Always happy to talk about those topics because, again, at the end of the day, we're in the business of improving health and bringing the innovation to the bedside. And unless people are masterful at doing this, the idea just remains an idea. It doesn't help anybody.
Absolutely.
Looking
Well,
forward to furthering the conversation. And again, thank you for inviting.
yeah, absolutely. I'd love to have you back on here in a few months and we can actually continue the dialogue. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.